going to go ahead anyways. So, yeah, today is going to be the Edge service. So that's our lab one. A lot of networking, quite a bit of Linux. About a quarter of it is Linux, um, and a lot of it is DNS. So you're going to be introduced to, like, they're not new technologies in terms of your use of them. Excuse me, but just new applications of them. So DNS, we're going to work with MX records for email, because DNS does support kind of pointing and discovering email. So we'll play with that a little bit. We're going to do a lot of interaction between DNS servers to make sure that we can get everything to function. So our end goal is we're going to have a Linux server on the outside, quote unquote, air quotes, which is going to be, VMnet 8. And then we're going to have another DNS server, which is available to the outside world. That's going to be on our Edge server. And we're also going to have our DNS server on the inside, which our Edge server is going to talk to, but nobody else is going to talk to. Okay, it's just going to be like nobody else external. So it's going to be able to talk to the internal world, figure out what accounts exist, all that kind of stuff. The Edge server will be able to do that, but it's going to be the only one that's talking to the outside world, like the Linux client and the Linux server. And what we want to do is just make sure that we can get everything functioning. We can send an email back and forth. Okay. So you'll learn about alternatives to Exchange and how small they can actually be. You don't have to pay a bomb to run a mail server. They can be extremely, like, totally free, essentially. It's just there's a learning curve. That's all. So we're going to work with all of that in this one. This is external communication. So you want to find this in week 5. Okay. And I'm going to do the lecture on the Edge role. I'll kind of get this started, but I'll do the lecture first. Okay. Okay, so firewalls and routing, big part of the process. Setting up a DMZ, that's included within that. Protocols that we're going to use, I'm going to talk about those. So we're really talking about the open email protocols. So not the proprietary ones from Microsoft, but things like POP, IMAP, SMTP, and DNS. Those are really the big ones that come into it. Okay? So DNS is included in those protocols. We're going to work with a Linux Internet Mail Server. So I chose Postfix just because it's very commonly found. Okay. A lot of people choose to use it. There are plenty of other ones out there. I've supported some of them. Like I worked with a Qmail server for years. There's a lot of different ones that are out there that people can choose from. Gmail actually implements its own IMAP server, so they don't share it with anybody. But when you're connecting to Gmail, that's Google has set up their own. Okay. Now we're going to have to do a lot of testing because you're not going to do everything right out of the box, typically. Okay, sometimes people do, but it's fairly uncommon. So we're going to be using a lot of NSLookup. We're going to be using ping and traceroute just to figure out firewalls and routing. You might do the odd nmap if you feel like it, just to see if certain ports are actually available. And we're going to talk about Edge role requirements, what you need to install it, and then the final objectives. So what is it as a deliverable that you're going to have to produce, right? Okay, so this is all about external access up to a point. We're faking it, right? But what we're going to do, we build the Edge role in a DMZ, and we set up the firewall rules strictly between the LAN and the DMZ. And the idea is if the DMZ gets hacked, or if the server in the DMZ gets hacked, it's not that easy to then make your way into the internal LAN where all of our juicy servers are, So we're not really going to trust this Edge role server. It's kind of, it's like the drunk uncle that you have at Thanksgiving, but you don't really want them to hang around that much. It's like they're going to be shunted off into the DMZ. So if the police come, you don't have to deal with reports and stuff like that. So we'll also need an external mail server. And part of the reason I chose Linux was I wanted you to have the experience of an alternative. But the other part of the reason is that it's so low on resources. Like you can run this with like 2 gigs of RAM, you know? This is much, much lighter. It makes it easier for the lab. You're less likely to have things crashing on you, okay? So it's just the cumulative effect of all of these servers. I wanted to lighten the load a little. So for us, VMnet 8 is going to be our internet. And we will test external internet access as well. But, we're not hosting anything out on the internet. So there are a few wrinkles that go further than what we've done. We've had to actually do a few gymnastics to fake out the internet. Okay. Now, everything's been done using 172.24x.x, and that's not routable on the internet. And I gave you a router to work with. Now you're going to build your own, right? So you've already done this a little bit in some other classes, probably Capstone. But we want to expand the functionality, right? The way you describe the example makes me think you've been the uncle. I don't know. I'd have to ask my family members. You know what your problem is? You need to cut your hair and get a job, hippie. Actually, I was the hippie, so let's see. So we want to expand the functionality to allow for the creation of a DMZ. I don't really care if you rebuild or if you just factory reset what I gave you, but it's actually almost easier to rebuild, So our edge server is going to reside in that third segment, that DMZ that you're going to create, okay? And now that's really going to be VMnet 1, right? So you're going to need to kind of pony up a new default gateway. So the general plan, create a new pfSense firewall router. You can recycle a copy of the other one. It doesn't make it any easier, though. In fact, it doesn't make it that much harder either. It doesn't make much of a difference. But you're going to have to configure it to have 3 interfaces. So one for internal connections, which is what we already have. One for external connections, which is our WAN interface. And you're going to add a third NIC, okay? And that'll be our DMZ connection. You don't always have to add a NIC, but it does provide a certain amount of physical. I know these are virtual machines, but it provides a certain amount of physical separation between networks, because you can configure one network card to have multiple subnets, and that can work great. But if you misconfigure it, there's no inherent separation between anything that's passing through that NIC, right? Whereas when you actually have physical NICs that are separate, you have to actively configure access to the other NIC, So there are some benefits to that. People often will do one or the other. It doesn't, it's a matter of choice, really. But for you guys, I'm going to ask you to create 3 NICs, okay? All future traffic, it's actually easier that way. It just requires a little more resources. So all future traffic is going to pass to this new router. So you're going to do a drop-in replacement. Now, what I want to point out here is this is a Class B network. So the third octet is actually part of the host section of that network, which means that when I gave you a 199.2 router, the fact that you had a different number didn't matter, right? It still worked because that's just part of the host section of the address. So when you replace that with your own third octet, everything can still work. You just update your default gateways, okay, to make sure that they reflect that new third octet. Okay, let's see. Okay, so yeah, traffic, all future traffic will pass through the router. Traffic from the DMZ to the internal network, we're going to be very strict on that, okay? We're not going to be strict on every single connection. So DMZ going out to the internet will be totally loose, okay? Is that the way it really works in the real world? No, but I didn't want to add multiple layers of confusion. I figured you'll struggle enough with those ports and getting things to function just DMZ to LAN. I didn't want to layer on making it difficult to connect from the DMZ to the outside world. So we're gonna leave that side alone. But in the real world, that would also be strictly controlled. Okay, and then from the LAN to the outside world, we're not really restricting anything. But from the outside world to the LAN, nothing is getting in. We're not using network address translation. Okay, and no external traffic should be able to reach it. Really, not directly. So it's only established connections coming from the inside, going out, and their replies. Those are the only things that'll work. Now, the DMZ should be able to reach the internet, and it should have limited access to our internal mailbox server. So, and also to our DC, just the DNS portion of it, and a little bit of LDAP. So it's very strictly controlled, though. We're opening up a few ports, but for the most part, you can't really do much to interact with the internal LAN from the DMZ. So UDP and TCP port 53 for DNS, we want that open from the DMZ to our internal DC. Okay, that's so we can do DNS querying of user accounts, servers, things like that. Because DNS actually accounts for a lot of how Active Directory functions. So we really need that to be available. Why both UDP and TCP? Some servers will run DNS on TCP as well. Okay, if you're ever using encrypted DNS, you're going to be using TCP. So it's not always necessary to open it up, but that is the recommendation that Microsoft made. Okay, TCP port 25 for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. So this is the way that mail gets sent from one server to another in the outside world. Okay, not Microsoft's proprietary products. You got to open that up because the mailbox server needs to be able to receive mail. Okay, so now we're just opening that up to our Edge server, and from the Edge server to our mailbox server. Okay, so the Edge server will be able to receive mail. It can then forward it on to the mailbox server. Microsoft does something weird, and they recommend that TCP port 2525 also be open. Okay, we're not really going to use it, but they do recommend it, so I'm going to ask you to open that up as well. Any traffic to 202, so VMnet 8, essentially. So any traffic from the DMZ to 202 is going to be open. This is loose, but I didn't want to turn this into firewall hell for you, and I know you're going to struggle a little bit with this, so I figured I'd kind of give you a break on the DMZ to the outside world. We'll also be loose with DMZ to internet traffic, so not just to 202, but also going out to 8.8.8, browsing the internet, that kind of stuff. Okay, but we will be strict with DMZ to internal traffic. Now there are other ports that's in the lab doc, so these aren't the only ones that we need. This is what we need for basic mail functionality, but there's other stuff going on under the hood, which you'll see in the lab doc. Okay, so a number of protocols are going to be involved here, and I'm actually going to lecture on these a little bit. You're also going to play with them a little bit. Now, we're turning off on the Linux server, we're not going to use any encryption at all. Okay. The reason I don't want to use encryption is that I want you to be able to probe and interact with the protocols so that you understand how they function. They're pretty old school, they're fairly straightforward, and the great thing about them is that you can actually just type and interact directly with the servers. Okay, so if there's a problem going on, you can actually telnet into the server, talk to it, and it'll tell you exactly what you're doing wrong. So if you can't connect to it through telnet, probably you got a firewall problem or the service isn't started, things like that, right? So not having encryption can allow us to figure out things in a little more detail, right? So SMTP, DNS, we're going to look at those protocols. POP3 and IMAP, we're going to talk about that. LDAP, I'm not really going to talk about much. It just works magically. But we are using a light version of LDAP, one that's not meant for an Active Directory domain join machine. This edge role server is not going to be part of the domain. Okay, it's going to be a standalone server, but we are going to give it the ability to query LDAP. And the idea here is it can do some passive queries, but it can't make any changes, right? So if it gets hacked, yeah, they can gather information, but they can't actually do much with it. So now DNS is especially important. You're going to use that a lot to test things. And it's a little more complicated because we have to fake out the internet a little bit. So there's a real enron.com out there, and we never want that to trigger as a resolve for DNS, right? We want to bypass it by essentially configuring our DNS servers so that there's never a chance to do a query to the outside world, essentially, for the domains that we want to control. Okay. So we need DNS to resolve our SMTP servers for our domains, to query AD from the edge server, and resolve external names, so to have external access in general, right? We're going to have 3 DNS servers. We're going to put one on the edge server. That is not typical. That's not the typical process. Okay. The reason we're doing it is I don't want to throw up another server and use another 4 gigs of RAM or however many you're going to use, So we're kind of consolidating roles onto a single server. Not best practice, but, we're in that situation. So there's going to be DNS on the edge server. There's going to be DNS on the Linux server. And there's also our AD DNS. We're going to use all of those. And they're going to be pointing to each other in different ways. Okay. So there's almost a circular connection that's being made between them. Almost. It's not quite circular. You don't want that infinite loop kind of thing, right? So we need to be careful about which DNS is pointing to which other DNS. It will get a little confusing, I'm going to tell you. But if you have a bad hierarchy, then you'll get naming failures. So if you find that you're resolving the external enron.com, that means you've got a bad hierarchy, just by mistake, and you have to figure out where that mistake is. Okay. So we're going to install Postfix on the Ubuntu Linux server. That's going to be our external SMTP service. Postfix also offers POP and IMAP, but we're not going to use it. I just decided just to show that you can interact between these different offerings. We're going to use Courier, POP, and IMAP to retrieve mail. Okay, and you're going to use a Thunderbird client on Linux to set up your mail client. Okay, so I could have used anything here. I just chose Courier because it's pretty common. I could have stuck with something with Postfix. I didn't want to do that though. I just wanted to show that variation was possible. Okay, and it's not that hard. It's pretty straightforward. Now we'll need to install what's called Bind DNS. That is the DNS that runs the internet. Okay, you'll find that out on the internet itself, there are no Windows DNS servers really. Almost all of them are running Bind, which is an open source DNS server. Okay, so if you go to the root servers out on the internet, you remember there's like 12 or 13 of those. I think 8 of them are Bind, right? The other ones, none of them are Windows, and the other one is a special DNS server that was created specifically because they didn't want them all to be Bind. So it's kind of got a bit of a monopoly here. Okay, it really does run the internet. We're not going to focus on certificates or any kind of security on the Linux side. Okay, we did do that for Exchange, but for Linux, I'd rather you see the protocols and be able to work with them, and that means we're not. I could add it as an add-on to the lab, but I think it's long enough as it is. Okay, it is useful to know, but it does complicate the lab, so I'm going to skip it for now. The tools we're going to use: Ping, which you're familiar with; Telnet, which you're probably not that familiar with, but you will be by the end of this. It's a nifty tool. It's very old school though. Um, Mail, which is a command line tool on Linux. You can actually send and receive email just through the command line. NSLookup, that's going to be a big one. And I introduced Netcat just because I like Netcat. And it's kind of, they call it the Swiss Army knife of Linux. So it's a general kind of like Telnet, but more flexible. Okay. It could do all sorts of things to connect to different ports. Now, the edge roll doesn't require as much resources as the mailbox roll. So thank God, right? You need 4 gigs of RAM, same number of processors. You don't need to join the domain. In fact, you should not. Okay. The software prerequisites are a little different. We're not installing IIS, and we're going to use a different Visual C++ redistributable that we're going to use. Now, that's up on SharePoint or on Brightspace. I can't quite remember. I think it's in Brightspace, actually. Now, the extra RAM requirements, there's going to be an extra 6 gigs of RAM. So we're going to be pushing things a little harder. Just be aware of that. You want to be a little gentler with everything. In the next assignment, we're going to push it up to 32 gigs, close to that. So be ready. I think we're going up to 28 or something like that. But this one, I think we go up to 24. I think that's what we're doing. Now, the Edge server, you want to fully patch it before you run the installation of Exchange. I say that, and that's what Microsoft recommends, but people have not done that, and it's worked out okay. It's just something to be careful with. If you're having problems, that could play a role. So far, it hasn't seemed to be a big deal. So, thorough testing of your network connections needs to be done. So we will do that as part of the assignment. And I actually wrote a script that'll help with a lot of the testing. And then, once you're good to go, you want to be confident that your network firewall settings have the appropriate ports open, right? So you want to keep in mind that you have 3 different firewalls that you're likely dealing with. There's the default gateway firewall. That's probably going to block you a lot of the time. But even when you get past that, you have a source firewall, which is probably not blocking you. And you have a destination firewall, which may be. Okay. So Windows Firewall can sometimes be the problem on one side or the other. Okay. Keep that in mind as you're trying to work through things. The Edge server is not trusted enough to join Active Directory, so we're not going to join it to the domain. But we will use a kind of a light version called the AD LDS role. So AD Lightweight Directory Service role. Okay. We're going to install that on the Edge server so that it can actually talk to the domain. Is that on the server or is that on the DC? I think it's on the DC, actually. But it's basically going to allow the Edge server to talk and be able to get information from the domain without being in the domain. Internal AD DNS needs to have an A record for the new Edge server. And then once the prerequisites are installed, you can run the Exchange setup from the ISO. So this is not, an OS install. It's you install the OS, then you install the EXE. Okay. And it'll set up the server role. Instead of selecting the mailbox role, we choose the Edge role. If there's any prerequisite check fails, you want to fix those before you go ahead. If you get a warning about DNS TCP, don't worry about it. You could just go ahead. Okay. Warnings typically are not that big a deal. Errors are a different story. So once installed, the Edge server needs to subscribe to your Active Directory. The way that we do this is that on the Edge server, we create a new Edge subscription, which is really just going to be an XML file with some details in it. Okay. And we're going to take that subscription file, we're going to move it over to our mailbox server, and then we're going to suck up the data in that and import it into the mailbox server. Okay. Once we do that, we're basically telling the mailbox server, you're in charge of this Edge role server now. And it will direct it from then on. Okay. So it can issue commands to it, tell it to do things. Once we've done that, we've set up, we've created that subscription, we've imported it, then we can start the Edge Sync service on our mailbox server, and it'll start actively managing the Edge role server. Okay. And so it'll control synchronization between them. Now, if you're having if you still haven't resolved firewall or DNS issues, this is where things might fail. Okay. What do you need to have at the end of the lab? Basically, you should be able to resolve the Enron domain from your Linux server. You should be able to resolve the mailbuddy.com, that's the Linux domain, from any and all Enron systems. Resolve other external DNS everywhere, just as an extra, Register a subscription of your Edge server with the mailbox server, allowing the mailbox server to manage the Edge server. And then the final deliverables are sending an email from your Linux user. We're going to send an email to Jim, okay? But it should work for any user. So basically sending an email to Jim asking for a job using the Thunderbird email client, okay? Now, when it comes to POP3 and IMAP, we set up both, and then I have Thunderbird use IMAP. I've had it where some people, they've messed something up and IMAP's not working for them, and I've had them use POP3 instead. I don't really care which of the two we're using, okay? But, just follow the defaults, and if we have a problem, we'll sort it out later. DNS should route the mail to the Edge server, which will then sync with the mailbox server, and then Jim should get his mail, okay? Then you send a reply from Jim, in this case, using Outlook or OA, and the Linux user should receive that email. So we're essentially doing the three-way handshake, two-way handshake. We're sending an email and we're receiving an email to make sure that both parties can reach each other. That's our proof of concept. Okay. After that, you're pretty much done. There's nothing else to do. But there's a lot of work that goes into that. So a lot of troubleshooting. Okay, so here's the lab. There's 4 parts to it. I'm going to mention here as a helpful tip, just with the firewalls, I remind you to keep in mind that the Windows firewall also plays a role. It's not just pfSense. So you may default to suspecting pfSense, but you want to kind of, in the back of your mind, you want to think, wait, could it be Windows? Okay, because that does happen quite a bit. All right. So part 1, create the pfSense firewall. I used to have people take screenshots. Now I'm just saying refer to the screenshot. So there were about 20 to 25 screenshots. I've brought that down to 5 with a bit of scripting. Okay. The scripting just does some network testing and things like that. Now, you can always take those screenshots if you want to, just like with the previous assignment. But you shouldn't have to. You can run the testing script anytime you want to, and it should be able to tell you what's failing. Okay. So I just say refer to screenshot LAN out. If you choose to go the path of actually creating screenshots, just take a screenshot at the same time. I've kept all of the reference images available to you. Okay. So part 1 was creating the pfSense firewall, just the basics of it. Part 2 is creating the Linux mail server. It's rather long. Not that bad, though. It's pretty guided. Part 3 is where we're setting up firewall rules explicitly between the DMZ and the DC, not the DC, the internal LAN. So here's the extra ports that you're going to need. Okay. We do a little bit of testing with Telnet to make sure we can get through. The highlighted red instructions are basically saying take a screenshot. So this is not just refer to, this is for anybody. I need you to take a couple, there's like 4 screenshots you have to take, then you run your script, then you take a screenshot of that output. Okay. So we've got a couple of them here, and then we go back to just referring to screenshots. So once you've got your edge synchronization up, then we want to send that email back and forth. Okay. And that's where the DNS testing comes in. So this is probably where a lot of the troubleshooting is going to occur. Okay. Um, Again, I've got screenshots to show you how things should be looking. You're like, hey, Jim, you got any job openings? If that works, you take a screenshot of it. And then Jim replies back, and he's like, check back in a month. Of course, we know that the company collapses, but that's kind of the ironic part of this. But basically, Jim's going to reply back. And if you manage to send both of those, you did a good job. Everything's working well. Okay. Any questions? I'll just point out this is the script which can do testing. Okay. So it'll tell us what's working and what's not, especially for DNS and stuff like that. So you could run that anytime, but it's going to produce a lot of errors initially. So there's not much point. When you're getting to the point where you think everything's tying together, and if it's not working, it might give you some insights. Okay. And then you could rerun it as many times as you need to. All it does is test the networking. It doesn't show email or anything like that. That's what the screenshots are for. Okay. I've got the marking guide here, as usual. So the ones that are highlighted in yellow, those are the ones that you need to take, okay, no matter what your submission is. All the other ones, they used to be screenshots. Now they're just, did you do these things? And I'll look at the screenshots, or I'll look at your script output to evaluate that. Okay. Sample submission if you're doing screenshots. And if you just want to see what I'm talking about, if you want a visual. Okay. Okay. If you have no questions, then I'll let you guys go to it. We got quite a lot of time for this. I've set aside 4 classes. So should be okay. Yeah, no problem. Catch you later. Okay, so Jacob, give me 10 minutes. I'll kind of arrange myself, and then you guys can do your demo there. Okay. Yeah, no problem.